June 22, 1986, Mexico City. Tommy Castellano had 48 hours to convince Diego Maradona to lose a football match. The English crime families had paid him £2 million to ensure Argentina would fall to England in the World Cup quarter-final. Tommy walked into the team hotel that morning with a briefcase full of cash and a simple message: miss your chances, let England score twice, walk away rich. He'd fixed bigger games, corrupted bigger names. But when he sat across from the small Argentine genius in room 412, something in Maradona's eyes told him this wouldn't go as planned. The kid wasn't interested in money. He was interested in revenge. What happened 51 minutes into that match changed everything, not just for football, not just for Argentina, but for Tommy Castellano, who watched from the stands as his entire world collapsed with two goals that should never have existed. The hand of God, the goal of the century. Two moments that destroyed a crime empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The crowbar bit into Tommy's skull with a wet crunch that echoed off the warehouse walls in Bermondsey. Blood streamed down his face as he tried to focus on the three shapes circling him in the dim light filtering through cracked windows. You fucked us, Tommy. Big Eddie Malone's voice carried the weight of 30 years running illegal books across South London. £2 million down the drain because you couldn't deliver one simple message. Tommy spat blood onto the concrete floor, his hands zip-tied behind the rusted chair. I delivered it. Told the little Argentine exactly what you wanted. Not my fault he didn't listen. The second blow came from behind, sending stars exploding across his vision. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Eddie's lieutenant, Razor Pete, breathing heavily from the effort. Bullshit. Eddie leaned close enough that Tommy could smell the cigarettes and cheap aftershave. You either fucked up the delivery, or you warned him off. Which is it? The truth was worse than either option. Tommy had watched Maradona's face change when he'd spoken those 3 sentences in the tunnel. First confusion, then disgust, then something that looked almost like amusement. The footballer had nodded once, said Entiendo, I understand, and turned away. But in that nod, Tommy had seen it. Maradona wasn't agreeing to throw the match. He was acknowledging a challenge. I told him England needed to win by 2 goals minimum, Tommy wheezed. Told him there'd be another 50,000 in it for him if he made sure Argentina's attacks broke down in the final third. Told him the money was already transferred to an account in Switzerland. And he said he understood. Eddie's fist caught him in the ribs, cracking at least 2. Then explain the hand of God, you lying piece of shit. Explain how he scored that goal 4 minutes later. Explain how every bookie in London had to scramble to cover positions that should have been locked in. Tommy couldn't explain it. In 38 years of thinking about those 90 minutes in Mexico City, he'd never been able to explain how Maradona had taken their ultimatum and turned it into the most audacious piece of cheating in football history. Not cheating for them, but against them. Against everything. Maybe, Tommy gasped, maybe he decided some things can't be bought. The third blow nearly took his head off. When his vision cleared, Eddie was pacing back and forth, mobile phone pressed to his ear. Yeah, it's me. We got Tommy here, and he's being difficult about Mexico. A pause. No, he's sticking to the story that he delivered the message clean. Tommy tried to follow the conversation, but the blood loss was making everything fuzzy. Through the haze, he caught fragments. Hartwell's kid, Eddie said. Journalism degree, writing about corruption. Another pause. University of London. Yeah, that's the one. The phone snapped shut, and Eddie's smile was all teeth and malice. You know what, Tommy? I believe you. I think you did deliver our message exactly right. I think Maradona understood perfectly what we wanted. Eddie pulled a pistol from his jacket, a black automatic that looked military. But here's what you don't understand. That match wasn't just about the money. It was about proving we could reach anyone, anywhere. Presidents, prime ministers, football gods, didn't matter. Everyone has a price. Except he didn't, Tommy whispered. Except he didn't, Eddie agreed, which made us look weak. Made people think they could say no to us. Do you have any idea how many deals fell apart because word got out that some Argentine footballer told the London families to fuck off? Tommy was losing consciousness, but Eddie's next words cut through the fog like ice water. 38 years we've been cleaning up that mess. 38 years of people thinking they can defy us. But now we got a chance to fix it permanently. Eddie pressed the gun against Tommy's temple. Billy Hartwell's granddaughter is writing her thesis on sports corruption. She's been asking questions about Mexico '86, about bookmakers, about funny money. The warehouse tilted sideways. What's that got to do with? Billy's old man was our inside man at the BBC. Set up the whole operation. If that comes out, if she traces it back. Eddie's finger moved to the trigger. Well, let's just say the family doesn't like loose ends. You can't touch her. She's just a kid. Oh, Tommy. Eddie's laugh was worse than the beating. We're not going to touch her. We're going to let her keep digging until she finds what she's looking for. And when she does, when she discovers her precious grandfather built his whole career on calling fixed matches, when she realizes her family legacy is built on corruption, the gun's safety clicked off. Sometimes the truth destroys people better than we ever could. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's chapter reveals a secret that will change everything you thought you knew about the beautiful game. Introduction. The gunshot echoed across the Thames like thunder, sending a murder of crows exploding from the warehouse rafters into the gray October sky. Eddie Malone holstered his pistol and nodded to Razor Pete, who was already moving toward the industrial furnace that had served the Malone family for 3 decades of making problems disappear. 23 miles away in Hampstead, Billy Hartwell was brewing his morning tea and had no idea that the last living witness to his father's betrayal had just been reduced to ash and memory. The kitchen of Billy's Georgian townhouse caught the pale autumn light through windows that hadn't been cleaned since his wife Margaret passed 2 years ago. Everything in the house carried her absence like a scent. The unopened crossword puzzle books she'd loved, the ceramic owl collection gathering dust on the mantelpiece, the second mug he still pulled from the cupboard by habit before remembering. Billy stood at the window overlooking Hampstead Heath, watching early joggers navigate the morning mist. At 71, his broadcaster's voice remained strong, but his body had begun the slow betrayal of age. Arthritis had claimed his cricket-playing hands, leaving them gnarled and stiff around his teacup. The tremor that started in his left index finger 6 months ago was spreading, though he'd told no one, not even Lucy. The thought of his granddaughter brought the familiar mixture of pride and worry that had become his constant companion. 22 years old and already showing the stubborn streak that ran through the Hartwell bloodline like a fault line, she'd inherited her grandmother's sharp mind and her great-grandfather's relentless pursuit of truth, a combination that had made William Hartwell Sr. one of the BBC's most respected executives and now threatened to make Lucy one of its most dangerous enemies. Billy's mobile buzzed against the kitchen counter. Lucy's name appeared on the screen alongside a photo from her graduation ceremony, her face bright with the particular joy of someone who believed journalism could change the world. "Morning, Grandpa. Are you watching the news?" Billy reached for the remote, already dreading what he might see. "Should I be?" BBC's running a retrospective on the '86 World Cup. They're using your commentary for the Argentina match. Her voice carried that breathless excitement he remembered from when she was 8 and had discovered his collection of match recordings in the attic. They called it the voice that captured lightning. The television flickered to life, and Billy's younger self filled the speakers. Maradona. Still Maradona. Now Hodge. And that's got to be a handball. But the referee's given it. Maradona has scored with his hand. But what genius from Maradona. Even after 38 years, the words felt like swallowing glass. He'd called it genius, but in that moment in the commentary box at the Estadio Azteca, he'd known it was something else entirely, something that would haunt him until his dying day. "Grandpa? You there?" Or, "Yes, sorry. Just memories. I'm actually writing about that match for my thesis. The whole tournament, really. There's something fascinating about the money flows during '86. The betting patterns were completely off normal projections." Billy's hand tightened around his mug. Through the window, the joggers had disappeared into the mist, leaving the heath empty except for the skeletal trees. "Lucy, love, I'm not sure that's the wisest topic for academic research. Why? Because it makes people uncomfortable? Grandpa, you taught me that journalism isn't supposed to be comfortable. Her voice carried the gentle mockery of someone who'd grown up hearing her own words reflected back at her. Besides, I think I'm onto something big. I've been tracking offshore accounts, shell companies that were active during the tournament. There's a pattern. The tremor in Billy's hand intensified. He set down the mug before it could betray him further. What kind of pattern? Money moving from London to Switzerland in the weeks before the England-Argentina match. Massive amounts. And get this, some of the paper trails lead back to people connected to the BBC. The words hit Billy like a physical blow. 48 hours ago, he'd been a widower living quietly with his memories and his guilt. Now the past was clawing its way back to the surface through the person he loved most in the world. Lucy, I need to tell you something about your great-grandfather. Actually, can we talk later? I'm meeting my supervisor in 20 minutes, and I want to run this BBC connection past her. But Grandpa? Her voice softened. I know this must be difficult. That match, losing to Argentina, it was probably the hardest thing you ever had to commentate on. But your call of Maradona's goals, both of them. It's poetry. It's history. You should be proud. The line went dead, leaving Billy alone with the echoes of his past and the growing certainty that Lucy's brilliant, relentless mind was about to destroy everything he'd spent 38 years trying to forget. Outside, the mist was lifting, but Billy had never felt more lost in the fog. Chapter 3, Inciting Incident. The envelope arrived with the afternoon post, sliding through Billy's mail slot like a blade between ribs. Thick cream paper, his name written in careful block letters across expensive stationery that belonged to another era. No return address, no postmark he could read through the smudged ink. Billy stared at it from his armchair for 20 minutes, before his arthritic fingers finally worked up the courage to tear it open. Inside, a single sheet of matching paper and a small digital recorder, the kind journalists used for interviews, the kind Lucy probably had a dozen of. The letter was brief. Mr. Hartwell, Tommy Flanagan is dead. Before he died, he made a recording. Thought you should hear it before certain other parties decide what to do with the information. A friend. Billy's hands shook as he examined the recorder. Modern technology disguised in retro housing, the kind of thing that cost more than his monthly pension. Professional equipment, expensive equipment, the kind that captured every whisper, every breath, every dying confession with perfect clarity. He pressed play. Tommy's voice filled the quiet house, thick with pain and something that might have been relief. My name is Thomas Patrick Flanagan. It's October 15th, 2024. I'm making this statement because I think I'm going to die tonight, and there are things that need saying. A cough, wet and rattling. In 1986, I was muscle for the Malone family. Eddie Malone's operation controlled most of the illegal betting in South London, but they had bigger ambitions. They wanted to prove they could fix anything, reach anyone, even a World Cup match. Billy's teacup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Earl Grey pooled around the porcelain shards like spilled blood, but he couldn't move to clean it up, couldn't do anything but listen to the voice of a dead man destroying his world word by word. The inside man was William Hartwell Sr., BBC executive, proper gentleman type, but he owed Eddie nearly $500,000 from bad horse racing debts. Eddie gave him a choice: help fix the England-Argentina quarter-final, or watch his family suffer for his gambling. The room tilted. Billy gripped the arms of his chair as Tommy's voice continued, each revelation falling like hammer blows. Hartwell Sr. arranged for his son Billy to call the match, made sure the commentary box had the right sightlines, the right access. They needed someone whose voice would be believed, someone whose word would become history. Billy Hartwell was England's golden boy of football commentary. When he called a match, people listened. But that wasn't enough. They needed insurance on the field. Tommy's breathing grew labored. That's where I came in. Eddie sent me to Mexico City. My job was simple: find Diego Maradona and deliver a message. Billy fumbled for the stop button, but his hands wouldn't obey. Some terrible gravity held him frozen as Tommy's confession poured into his living room like poison gas. I cornered Maradona in the tunnel before the match. Told him England needed to win by 2 goals minimum. Told him there was £50,000 waiting in a Swiss account if he made sure Argentina's attacks broke down when it mattered. Told him people would get hurt if he didn't cooperate. The recorder crackled with static, then Tommy's voice returned, weaker now, but something went wrong. I saw it in his eyes when I delivered the message. He wasn't scared, he was angry, really angry, like I'd just declared war on something sacred. Billy closed his eyes, but he could still see it. Mexico City, 1986. The press box high above the Estadio Azteca. Maradona rising for that impossible header that became an impossible handball. His own voice calling it genius when he knew it was really revenge. 4 minutes into the second half, Maradona scored with his hand. Called it the hand of God later, but I knew what it really was. Tommy's laugh turned into a coughing fit that lasted 30 seconds. It was the hand of someone who refused to be bought, who took our threat and threw it back in our faces in front of the whole world. The confession continued for another 10 minutes, laying out details that made Billy's stomach turn. How his father had fed information to the bookmakers. How the BBC's camera angles had been specifically chosen to obscure certain views of the penalty area. How the entire operation had fallen apart when Maradona decided to score the most beautiful goal in football history just minutes after cheating his way to the first. When Tommy's voice finally faded to silence, Billy sat in the wreckage of everything he'd believed about his life. His father hadn't been the honorable BBC executive he'd worshipped as a boy. His greatest moment as a commentator had been orchestrated by criminals. Even his marriage to Margaret, his career, his reputation, all of it built on a foundation of lies and corruption. The phone rang. Lucy's name on the caller display. Billy stared at the device, knowing that answering it would change everything forever. She was close now, too close, her brilliant mind working through the same financial trails that Tommy had just confirmed. Soon she'd trace those Swiss accounts back to her great-grandfather, back to Billy himself. The phone rang again, then again. Billy reached for it with hands that belonged to a stranger. #Chapter 4, Early Development. Hello, Lucy. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone whose world hadn't just collapsed into rubble and lies. Grandpa, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Lucy's words tumbled together in her excitement. That breathless rush she'd had since childhood, when she discovered something important. You're not going to believe what I've found. Those Swiss accounts I mentioned, I've traced 3 of them back to London shell companies that were active in 1986. And one of the signatories, Grandpa, are you listening? Billy forced himself to focus on her voice while Tommy Flanagan's confession echoed in his skull like tinnitus. Yes, dear, I'm here. One of the signatories was someone with the initials WH at the BBC. William Hartwell. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Grandpa? That's great-grandfather's name, isn't it? The tremor in Billy's hands spread up his arms. On the floor, the spilled tea had already begun to stain the wood Margaret had loved so much. Lucy, where are you right now? The British Library. I've been here since dawn, going through archived financial records. Grandpa, this is huge. If someone at the BBC was involved in match fixing during the '86 World Cup, stop. The word came out sharper than he intended. Just stop digging, Lucy, please. What? Why would you? Her voice changed, became careful, professional. The tone she used when interviewing reluctant sources. Grandpa, you're scaring me. Do you know something about this? Billy closed his eyes and saw his father's face the day after the Argentina match. How William Hartwell Sr. had aged a decade overnight. How he'd stopped meeting Billy's eyes when they talked about the World Cup. How he'd died 6 months later of a heart attack that everyone said was stress-related. I need to see you, Billy said. Can you come home? We need to talk face to face. I can't. My supervisor wants to see these documents before the library closes. But tomorrow, tonight, Lucy. It has to be tonight. The urgency in his voice must have reached her, because her academic excitement cooled into something approaching alarm. All right, I'll catch the last train. But Grandpa, you're worrying me. What's going on? After she hung up, Billy sat among the ruins of his afternoon tea, and tried to decide what he was going to tell her. The truth would destroy her faith in everything she'd inherited, not just the family name, but the very idea that journalism could be honorable, that institutions like the BBC could be trusted. The lies would destroy her investigation and maybe keep her safe. But Lucy was too smart and too stubborn to be deflected for long. The phone rang again. Unknown number. Billy almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up on the fourth ring. Static filled the line, then a voice that sounded like gravel mixed with cigarette ash. Billy Hartwell. Yes? My name's Pete Collins. I think we need to have a conversation. The accent was pure East London, the kind that came from growing up around the docks and learning that violence was just another way of doing business. Billy's blood turned to ice water. I don't know who you are. Course you don't. But I knew your dad. Worked with him back in '86. Lovely man, your father. Shame about his gambling problem. A pause filled with malevolent satisfaction. Heard your granddaughter's writing about football corruption. Academic research very impressive. Billy's throat closed. The recorder sat on the side table like an unexploded bomb, Tommy's voice still trapped inside its digital memory. What do you want? Want? Nothing at all. Just thought you should know that people are taking an interest. You're Lucy. She's asking the right questions, getting close to the right answers. Another pause. Funny thing about the truth, Mr. Hartwell. Sometimes it protects people. Sometimes it gets them hurt if you touch her. Touch her? Pete's laugh was like breaking glass. Who said anything about touching? The girl's doing brilliant work, really brilliant. Be a shame if she found out her great-grandfather was a criminal and her beloved grandpa helped cover it up for 38 years. That kind of revelation, it changes a person, sometimes permanently. The line went dead. Billy stared at the phone until the screen went black, reflecting his face like a broken mirror. Outside, the afternoon light was fading toward evening, and somewhere in London, Lucy was poring over financial records that would lead her straight into the heart of her family's darkest secret. He tried calling her back, but it went straight to voicemail. She was probably underground on the tube, heading home with a briefcase full of evidence that would destroy everything they both loved. Billy looked at the recorder again, then at the anonymous letter that had delivered it. Before certain other parties decide what to do with the information, the trap was already closing. The only question was whether he could find a way to save Lucy before she walked into it. Chapter 5. Middle Development. Billy remained frozen in his chair long after the phone's screen went dark, Pete Collins' threat echoing through the house like a curse. The broken teacup lay forgotten on the floor, its fragments catching the last light filtering through the windows. Somewhere across London, Lucy was traveling home with documents that would unravel 38 years of carefully maintained silence. He forced himself to stand, his arthritic joints protesting after hours of paralyzed stillness. The recording device seemed to pulse with malevolent life on the side table, Tommy Flanagan's voice trapped inside like a demon in a bottle. Billy picked it up with trembling fingers and walked to Margaret's old writing desk, the one she'd used for her charity correspondence until the cancer took her. The desk drawer stuck, warped from years of London's damp climate. When it finally gave way, Billy found what he was looking for, Margaret's private papers, the ones he'd never had the courage to sort through. Beneath her final letters to friends and a half-finished thank-you note to the hospice staff, he discovered a manila folder marked William Sr. in her careful script. Inside were documents he'd never seen before. A bank statement from 1986 showing a deposit of £50,000 into his father's account, made 3 days after the Argentina match. A letter from a Swiss financial institution confirming the closure of an account bearing his father's name. And at the bottom, in Margaret's handwriting, Billy must never know. The shame would destroy him. His wife had known. For how long? Years? Decades? Billy sank into Margaret's chair as another pillar of his world crumbled to dust. She'd watched him struggle with the guilt of that commentary, had held him through nightmares where Maradona's hand reached toward the sky like an accusation. She'd known the real reason for his father's heart attack, the weight of shame that had literally killed the man Billy had worshipped. A car door slammed outside. Through the window, Billy saw Lucy climbing out of a taxi, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder and a thick folder clutched against her chest. Even in the gathering darkness, he could see the excitement in her posture, the quick stride of someone who believed they were about to change the world. Billy swept the documents back into Margaret's folder and shoved it into the desk drawer. The recording device went into his jacket pocket, a cold weight against his chest. By the time Lucy's key turned in the front door, he was back in his armchair, trying to arrange his features into something approaching normalcy. "Grandpa?" Her voice carried the forced lightness of someone trying not to alarm an elderly relative. "I'm back." She appeared in the doorway looking every inch the investigative journalist, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, ink stains on her fingers from hours of note-taking, eyes bright with the particular fever of someone closing in on their prey. In that moment she looked exactly like her great-grandfather had during his BBC days, when William Hartwell Sr. was known for his relentless pursuit of difficult stories. "The house smells like tea," Lucy said, noticing the broken cup. "Did you have an accident?" "Clumsy hands," Billy lied. "You know how it is." Lucy knelt to gather the porcelain fragments, her movements efficient and careful. "We should talk about what I found today, but first, let me clean this up properly. You could cut yourself." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Billy closed his eyes and tried to imagine telling her everything. "Your great-grandfather was a criminal who sold out his country for gambling debts. Your beloved BBC is built on corruption. The greatest moment in football history happened because a young Argentine refused to be bought, and your grandfather spent 38 years calling it genius, while knowing it was really an act of defiance against men who thought everything could be purchased." Lucy returned with a dustpan and towel, moving with the quick competence that reminded him painfully of Margaret. There, good as new, she settled onto the sofa across from him, opening her folder with the reverence of a priest handling scripture. "Now, about those financial records, Lucy." "I know this is difficult," she interrupted. "Family history can be complicated. But if great-grandfather was somehow connected to match-fixing, we need to know. The academic integrity of my thesis depends on it, but more than that." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "People deserve the truth, don't they? Isn't that what you taught me?" Billy's own words reflected back at him like shards of the broken teacup. He'd raised her to be fearless in pursuit of truth, never imagining that particular fearlessness would one day threaten to destroy them both. The recording device felt like a stone in his pocket. Pete Collins' voice whispered in his memory, "That kind of revelation, it changes a person. Sometimes permanently." "Show me what you found," Billy said quietly, knowing he was about to watch his granddaughter build the scaffold that would hang them all. Lucy spread her documents across the coffee table with the systematic precision of a pathologist performing an autopsy. Financial records, photocopied bank statements, and highlighted spreadsheets formed a mosaic that Billy recognized with sickening clarity, the paper trail his father had tried so desperately to bury. "Look at this," Lucy said, pointing to a column of figures. 3 payments from Swiss accounts, all routed through London shell companies, all deposited into BBC executive accounts between May and July 1986. The amounts correspond exactly to the World Cup betting pools, Billy finished, his voice hollow. Lucy's head snapped up. "How did you know that?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Billy stared at his granddaughter's face, Margaret's chin, his father's determined eyes, but her mother's gift for seeing through lies. She was already connecting dots he'd hoped she'd never find. "Lucky guess," he said weakly. "No." Lucy's voice sharpened, taking on the edge that had made her professors call her the most promising investigative journalist of her generation. "That's not a guess, that's knowledge." She pulled another document from her folder, this one bearing the BBC letterhead. "I found the memorandum authorizing commentary assignments for the '86 World Cup. Guess whose signature is on it?" Billy didn't need to look. "Your great-grandfather's. And guess who got the plum assignment? England's biggest match." Lucy's eyes were bright with discovery and something that might have been betrayal. "You, Grandpa. My wonderful grandfather who always told me his greatest moment was calling Maradona's genius." The recording device seemed to burn against Billy's ribs. On it, Tommy Flanagan's voice waited to confirm everything Lucy suspected and worse, so much worse. "Lucy, please." I spent all afternoon thinking there had to be an explanation, she continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train approaching a cliff. Maybe great-grandfather was investigating corruption, not participating in it. Maybe the money was evidence he was gathering. But then I found this. She produced a photocopy of a bank deposit slip. Billy's father's name in careful script, £50,000 credited 3 days after England's elimination. The same amount Tommy had mentioned in his confession. Blood money, Lucy whispered. Payment for services rendered. And you knew, didn't you? You've always known. Billy watched his granddaughter's face change as the truth settled into her bones. The excitement of discovery curdled into something uglier. Disappointment, disgust, and beneath it all, the particular pain that comes from realizing the people you worship are human. That's why you never talked about the match details, she said, pieces falling into place with terrible precision. Why you changed the subject when I asked about the commentary. Why you kept all those newspaper clippings but never the BBC footage. Lucy, because you couldn't bear to hear your own voice calling corruption genius. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the last light was dying over London. God, how long have you been carrying this? How long have you been lying to me? The accusation hit Billy like a physical blow. 38 years of careful omissions and half-truths, of letting his granddaughter build her career on the foundation of his supposed integrity. Every journalism award she'd won, every story she'd broken, every time she'd quoted his advice about speaking truth to power, all of it contaminated now by the knowledge of his complicity. I was going to tell you, he said, the words tasting like ash. Tonight. That's why I needed you to come home. Lucy spun around, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like grief. Were you? Really? Or were you going to find another way to keep me from the truth? Before Billy could answer, his phone rang. Pete Collins again, the timing too perfect to be coincidental. Billy stared at the device, knowing that answering it would confirm Lucy's worst suspicions about how deep this conspiracy ran. Aren't you going to answer? Lucy asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Billy's hand moved toward the phone, then stopped. Because in that moment, looking at his granddaughter's face, he realized something that made his blood freeze. This wasn't about protecting family secrets anymore. Pete Collins hadn't called to threaten. He'd called because he was watching, because he knew exactly when Lucy would confront Billy with her evidence. He's been following you, Billy whispered, the full scope of the trap becoming clear. Collins. He wanted you to find those records. Lucy's expression shifted from anger to alarm. Who's Collins? Grandpa, what are you talking about? The phone stopped ringing, but Billy knew it didn't matter. The damage was done. Lucy had been led exactly where they wanted her, to this moment, this revelation, this choice between her family and her principles. And Billy finally understood Pete Collins' real threat. It wasn't about silencing the truth, it was about weaponizing it. #Chapter 7, Climax Build Up. Billy's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Lucy stared at him, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as the implications settled into her mind. The documents scattered across the coffee table suddenly looked different, not evidence she'd discovered, but breadcrumbs deliberately scattered for her to follow. Following me? Her voice cracked on the words. Grandpa, you're not making sense. Who is Pete Collins? Billy pulled the recording device from his pocket with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Someone from your great-grandfather's past. Someone who's been waiting 38 years for this moment. He set the device on the table among Lucy's carefully organized evidence. And I think you need to hear what's on this before we go any further. Lucy looked between her grandfather and the device, her investigative instincts warring with a growing sense of dread. What is that? The truth, Billy said simply, the real truth about 1986, about your great-grandfather, about me, about everything you think you know. His finger hovered over the play button. But once you hear it, there's no going back. Collins knows that. He's counting on it. I don't understand. He's using you, Lucy. Your research, your integrity, your need to expose corruption. He's turning it all into a weapon. Billy's voice carried the weight of dawning comprehension. This isn't about justice. It's about revenge. Lucy sank back onto the sofa, her academic excitement completely extinguished now. Revenge for what? Before Billy could answer, the landline rang again. Not Billy's mobile this time, but the house phone, a number only family and close friends possessed. The caller ID displayed a blocked number, but they both knew who it was. "Answer it," Lucy said quietly. "I want to hear what he has to say." Billy lifted the receiver with trembling fingers and pressed the speaker button. Pete Collins's voice filled the room like poison gas. "Evening, Billy. Hope I'm not interrupting family time. What do you want, Collins?" A low chuckle. "Want? I've got everything I want right here. Your granddaughter's done beautiful work today, really beautiful. Hours at the British Library, photographing records, building her case. Very thorough." The malice in his voice was unmistakable. "Tell me, Lucy, you are listening, aren't you, love? How does it feel to know your whole family legacy is built on corruption?" Lucy leaned forward, her journalistic training overriding her fear. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" Smart girl, asking the right questions. Pete's breathing was audible through the speaker, labored and wet. "Your great-grandfather ruined a good man back in '86, Tommy Castellano. Heard of him? Course you haven't. History's written by the winners, isn't it?" Billy felt ice forming in his veins. "Tommy's dead." "Tommy's dying," Pete corrected. "Lung cancer. 6 months, maybe less, which is why he decided to set the record straight before he meets his maker." Another pause. "That recording you're holding, Billy, Tommy made that for me. Every detail about how your father forced him to arrange the fix, how the BBC was up to its neck in corruption, how your commentary covered up the biggest fraud in football history." Lucy's eyes fixed on the recording device with horrified fascination. "The fix didn't work," she whispered. "Maradona scored anyway." "Clever girl," Pete said approvingly. "The fix didn't work because Tommy couldn't bring himself to go through with it. Grew a conscience at the last minute. But your family still took the money, didn't they? Still profited from the attempt." Billy closed his eyes, seeing his father's face that terrible day after the match. The relief mixed with shame, the way William Hartwell Sr. had aged a decade overnight when Argentina knocked England out of the tournament. "So here's what's going to happen," Pete continued, his voice hardening. "Young Lucy is going to publish her research, every detail, every document, every connection between the BBC and match fixing. She's going to destroy the family name just like her great-grandfather destroyed Tommy's life." "No," Billy said firmly. "I won't let you use her." "Use her?" Pete's laugh was like breaking glass. "I'm not using anyone, mate. I'm just letting justice take its course. Lucy's an honest journalist, isn't she? Believes in truth and transparency. Well, now she's got the biggest story of her career sitting right in her lap." Lucy looked between the phone and her grandfather, understanding finally dawning. "You're blackmailing us." "Blackmail? Harsh word. I prefer motivation. See, Lucy, you've got a choice. You can bury this story, protect your precious family reputation, and spend the rest of your life knowing you're just another corrupt journalist covering up the truth. Or you can publish it all, destroy your grandfather's legacy but maintain your integrity." Billy reached for Lucy's hand, but she pulled away, staring at the recording device as if it were a venomous snake. "Either way," Pete continued, "Tommy gets his justice. Either your family burns or your conscience does. Beautiful symmetry, don't you think?" The line went dead, leaving them alone with the weight of an impossible choice and the truth that waited, patient and terrible, on the device between them. Hashtag Chapter 8, Climax. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Lucy stared at the recording device, her face pale in the lamplight, while Billy watched his granddaughter grapple with the impossible choice Pete Collins had laid before her. Outside, London's evening traffic hummed its familiar tune, oblivious to the world cracking apart in this small sitting room. "Play it," Lucy said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Billy's finger trembled over the button. "Lucy, once you hear this—" "I said play it." Steel crept into her tone, the same iron determination that had made her great-grandfather a formidable broadcaster and her a fearless journalist. "If my entire career is built on lies, I need to know." Billy pressed play. Tommy Castellano's voice filled the room, weary and ravaged by illness, but still carrying the ghost of the smooth operator who had once fixed matches across Europe. As the confession unfolded, the gambling debts, the pressure from Collins's crime family, the meeting in the London pub where William Hartwell Sr. had agreed to participate, Billy watched his granddaughter's face transform. The Lucy who had walked through the door an hour ago, excited by her research discoveries, was dying before his eyes. In her place sat someone harder, older, bearing the weight of betrayal that only family can inflict. When Tommy's voice described the moment he decided not to go through with the fix, Lucy's hand moved to cover her mouth. "He chose honor," she whispered. "Tommy Castellano chose honor, and great-grandfather chose money. It was different then," Billy said desperately. "The gambling debts, the threats—" "Stop." Lucy's voice cut like a blade. "Just stop defending him, and stop defending yourself." She turned to face him fully, and Billy saw Margaret's moral clarity burning in those familiar eyes. "You knew. For 38 years you knew, and you let me build my entire identity around the myth of our family's integrity." The accusation landed like a physical blow, but Billy forced himself to meet her gaze. "I was protecting you." "From what? The truth?" Lucy stood abruptly, pacing to the window where Margaret's roses bloomed in the gathering darkness. "Do you know what my last article was about, Grandpa? Match-fixing in European leagues. I spent weeks exposing corruption, writing about the sanctity of sport, quoting you about the importance of truth in journalism." Her voice cracked. "All while sitting in your living room, surrounded by the evidence of your own family's corruption." Billy felt something breaking inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper. The careful construction of justifications and rationalizations he'd built over decades was collapsing like a house of cards. "Margaret knew," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Lucy spun around, her face stricken. "What?" "Your grandmother. She knew about your great-grandfather's involvement. I found documents in her desk tonight, papers she'd hidden to protect me from the truth." Billy pulled out Margaret's folder with numb fingers. "She carried that secret for years, watching me struggle with guilt over commentary I thought was honest." Lucy sank back onto the sofa as this fresh betrayal washed over her. Even she was lying to me? She was protecting our family. "No," Lucy interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "She was protecting her own comfort. You all were. Great-grandfather took money to corrupt sport. You stayed silent to protect your reputation, and Gran buried evidence to maintain the lie." She looked at Billy with something approaching pity. "How many people had to suffer for your family's comfort? How many young players like Tommy Castellano had their lives destroyed while the Hartwells counted their blood money?" Billy opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain the complexities and pressures, but the words wouldn't come. Because looking at Lucy, really looking at her, he saw what 38 years of lies had cost, not just his own soul, but the innocence of someone he loved more than life itself. "You're right," he said simply. Lucy blinked, clearly expecting further arguments. "You're absolutely right," Billy continued, his voice strengthening. "About all of it. Your great-grandfather was a criminal. I was a coward. Margaret was complicit." He stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting, and walked to his old BBC microphone, a memento he'd kept on the mantelpiece for decades. "And Pete Collins is using your integrity as a weapon because he knows we can't live with ourselves if we suppress the truth." Lucy watched him warily. "What are you saying?" Billy picked up the microphone, feeling its familiar weight. How many lies had he spoken into devices like this? How many half-truths and careful omissions? "I'm saying Collins has already won," Billy said, meeting his granddaughter's eyes. "Because he was right about one thing. You are an honest journalist. You won't bury this story even to save our family name, and neither should you." For the first time since the phone call ended, Lucy looked uncertain. "Grandpa?" "Publish it all," Billy said firmly. "Every document, every detail, every ugly truth. Let the world know what the Hartwells really were." He smiled sadly. "It's time to choose who we want to be. Chapter 9, Resolution." 6 months later, Billy Hartwell sat in the same chair where his world had ended, watching the morning light filter through Margaret's roses. The garden looked different now, smaller somehow, as if the weight of truth had compressed even the physical space around him. The BBC microphone still sat on the mantelpiece, but it no longer felt like a trophy. It was simply what it had always been, a tool that could carry either truth or lies, depending on the person who held it. Lucy's article had run 3 weeks after their confrontation, spread across 4 pages of The Guardian with additional coverage in every major European sports publication. The Fix That Failed, how the BBC covered up football's greatest scandal, had won 2 journalism awards already, and Lucy had been offered positions at 3 international news organizations. She'd turned them all down, choosing instead to stay in London and start an investigative unit focused on sports corruption. The fallout had been everything Pete Collins could have hoped for. The BBC had launched an internal investigation, stripping William Hartwell Sr. of his posthumous honors and removing his broadcasts from their official archives. Billy's own commentary work had been quietly scrubbed from promotional materials, 40 years of distinguished service reduced to an embarrassing footnote. The family name that had once opened doors now closed them with quiet professional efficiency. But Pete Collins hadn't lived to see his victory. Tommy Castellano's call had come 2 weeks after the article's publication. Pete had died of emphysema, alone in a Manchester hospice, Tommy's recording clutched in his yellowed fingers. Justice, it seemed, was a cold meal even for the victor. Billy heard the key in the front door and smiled despite everything. Lucy had been visiting every Sunday since the article ran. Their relationship transformed but not destroyed. The easy affection was gone, replaced by something more complex, respect mixed with sadness, love tempered by the knowledge of human frailty. "Morning, Grandpa." Lucy entered carrying groceries and newspapers, the professional wariness she now wore like armor, softening only slightly in his presence. "Morning, love." Billy watched her move through Margaret's kitchen with familiar efficiency. She'd lost weight since becoming the journalist who exposed her own family's corruption, the stress evident in the sharp angles of her shoulders. "How's the new investigation going?" "Good. Complicated, but good." Lucy returned with tea, settling into Margaret's chair, a gesture that would have been unconscious months ago but now felt deliberately chosen. "We're looking into match fixing in women's football. Turns out corruption doesn't limit itself to men's sports." Billy nodded, recognizing the careful distance she maintained even during casual conversation. Every interaction was now filtered through the knowledge of his complicity, their shared history rewritten by the weight of revealed truths. "I got a letter from Tommy Castellano's daughter yesterday," Lucy said quietly, pulling an envelope from her bag. "She wanted to thank us for the article. Said her father died believing justice had finally been served." "Did it feel like justice to you?" Billy asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on the devastation she'd chosen to unleash. Lucy considered the question with the same careful precision she brought to her investigative work. "I think justice is supposed to feel better than this," she said finally. "But maybe that's the point. Real justice isn't about feeling good, it's about choosing truth over comfort, even when the truth destroys things you love." Billy studied his granddaughter's face, seeing Margaret's moral clarity tempered by a sadness that hadn't existed before their confrontation. Lucy had chosen integrity over family protection, but the victory had aged her in ways that went beyond the sleepless nights and professional pressure. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Publishing the story?" "Every day," Lucy admitted, her honesty as sharp as a blade. "But I'd make the same choice again. That's what integrity means, isn't it? Doing what's right even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted." Billy felt something shift in his chest, not healing exactly, but a loosening of the guilt that had defined him for nearly 4 decades. His granddaughter had found a way to live with the weight of her choices that he never had. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," he said, meaning it completely. Lucy's smile carried both warmth and infinite sadness, and disappointed in both of us. But maybe that's okay. Maybe disappointment is just the price of being human. Outside, London carried on its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the small tragedies and hard-won redemptions playing out in sitting rooms across the city. The story would fade from public memory eventually, replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrage. But the choice Lucy had made, to sacrifice comfort for truth, would echo through both their lives forever. Billy reached for his granddaughter's hand, unsurprised when she let him take it. They sat together in Margaret's roses and morning light, two people learning that love could survive even the complete destruction of trust, transformed but somehow stronger for having faced the worst of themselves and chosen something better. Some stories, Billy realized, stayed with you not because they ended happily, but because they ended honestly. Hashtag Chapter 10. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, its deep notes reverberating through the sitting room like a funeral bell. Billy held Lucy's hand for another moment before releasing it, understanding that even this small gesture of reconciliation came with conditions now. Carefully negotiated affection between two people who had learned that love and trust were entirely different currencies. "There's something else," Lucy said, her journalist's instincts evident in the way she straightened slightly, preparing to deliver information that would shift the emotional landscape between them once again. "Something I didn't tell you last week." Billy felt his stomach tighten. After months of revelations and aftershocks, he'd begun to hope they'd reach the bottom of the well. "What is it?" Lucy pulled a manila folder from her bag, the same type Margaret had used to hide family secrets. Billy noted with bitter irony. "I've been contacted by other families, children and grandchildren of people who were involved in match-fixing scandals from the 70s and 80s. They read my article and—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They want help exposing their own family histories." The weight of this revelation settled over Billy like a burial shroud. "How many?" 17 so far. Match officials, club executives, even other broadcasters. Lucy opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents that spoke of a corruption network far more extensive than either of them had imagined. Grandpa, what great-grandfather was involved in, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger. Billy leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 71 years. The scope of what Lucy was describing threatened to dwarf even the devastation her original article had caused. This wasn't just about exposing the Hartwell family's sins anymore. It was about unraveling decades of systemic corruption that had infected the very heart of British football. "You're going to write about all of it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have to." Lucy's voice carried the same inexorable certainty that had driven her to publish the original story. "These people are coming forward because they saw what happened with our family. They saw that it was possible to choose truth over comfort, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew about the people you loved." Billy studied his granddaughter's face, recognizing something he hadn't seen in months, a spark of the passionate idealism that had first drawn her to journalism. The weight of exposing her own family had nearly crushed that spark, but apparently it had survived, transformed into something harder and more purposeful. "This will end your chances of having a normal career," Billy said quietly. "You'll be known as the journalist who destroys families, who makes children question everything their parents and grandparents stood for." Lucy nodded, accepting this future with the same clear-eyed determination Margaret had once brought to her most difficult decisions. Maybe that's what the world needs right now, someone willing to hold up a mirror to the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about our heroes. Billy walked to the window, gazing out at Margaret's roses with their eternal cycles of bloom and decay. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of Sunday morning football matches in the local park, children playing the beautiful game with pure joy, unknowing and uncaring about the corruption that had poisoned the professional sport they idolized. "Your grandmother planted those roses the year you were born," he said, not turning around. "She said she wanted you to grow up understanding that beautiful things require tending, that they don't just happen by accident." "What's your point?" Lucy asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. Billy turned to face her, seeing Margaret's moral courage reflected in those familiar features. "My point is that maybe you're tending something she planted long before any of us understood what it would grow into. Maybe this is exactly what she hoped you'd become." Lucy's composure cracked slightly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "It doesn't feel like tending. It feels like burning everything down." "Sometimes," Billy said gently, "burning down is the only way to plant something new." They sat in contemplative silence, watching dust motes dance in the morning light that streamed through windows Margaret had cleaned for 40 years. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of carried secrets had been pressing down on the very foundations. There would be more revelations, more families torn apart by the choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. There would be more sleepless nights and professional consequences, and the particular loneliness that came with being right about things nobody wanted to acknowledge. But there would also be this: two people who had looked directly at the worst of themselves and their family, and chosen something better. Two people learning that integrity wasn't about being perfect, but about being willing to face the consequences of imperfection with clear eyes and steady hands. Billy reached for the manila folder, understanding that his role in this story wasn't over. "Tell me about these other families," he said. "Tell me how I can help." Lucy opened the folder with steady hands, though Billy noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she spread the documents across Margaret's coffee table. The morning light caught the edges of photographs and handwritten letters, creating a mosaic of other people's buried shame. "This is Sarah Chen," Lucy said, pointing to a formal headshot of a woman in her 40s. Her father was a referee in the first division during the 80s. She found betting slips in his effects after he died, matches where he'd wagered against teams he was officiating. The amounts match up with controversial calls he made. Billy studied the photograph, seeing something familiar in Sarah Chen's expression, the same haunted look Lucy had worn for months after publishing her article. "She wants to expose him publicly?" "She wants to understand what she's inherited," Lucy corrected. "Sarah's son is training to be a referee. She's terrified he'll enter a system that's still corrupt, but she doesn't know how deep the rot goes without investigating her father's involvement." Billy picked up another document, a bank statement from 1983 with deposits that seemed far too large for a club groundskeeper's salary. And this? Michael Patterson. His grandfather worked at Leeds United. These deposits coincide with matches where the pitch conditions were unusually favorable for visiting teams who weren't expected to win. Lucy's voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to read corruption in the minutiae of everyday life. Michael's been having nightmares since he realized what the pattern meant. The folder contained 17 such stories, each one a small tragedy of inherited guilt. Billy recognized the particular anguish in each family member's letter, the moment when childhood heroes revealed themselves to be something smaller and more human than memory had allowed. "They're not just seeking absolution," Lucy continued, her journalist's mind organizing the chaos into coherent narrative. "They want to understand how systematic this was, whether their family members were criminals or victims or something more complicated." Billy felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "And you think I can help them understand?" "You lived through it," Lucy said simply. "You knew the pressure, the culture, the way decent people could be pulled into something that seemed manageable at first. These families need someone who can explain how their loved ones justified the choices they made." Billy walked to the mantelpiece, where his BBC microphone sat like a monument to professional compromise. "I spent 38 years not understanding it myself. What makes you think I have answers for them?" Lucy joined him at the mantelpiece, her reflection ghost-like in the brass surface of his old award plaques. "Because you finally stopped lying to yourself about it. That's what they need. Someone who's walked through the fire of complete honesty about family complicity." "The fire," Billy repeated, tasting the metaphor. "Is that what this feels like to you?" Lucy nodded slowly. "But I think we're through the worst of it now. The burning part, anyway." She gestured toward the documents spread across Margaret's coffee table. "This feels different. Less like destruction and more like archaeology. Carefully uncovering what was always there, just buried." Billy understood what she meant. The rage and betrayal that had characterized their early conversations had evolved into something more purposeful, a shared commitment to witnessing truth, regardless of its comfort level. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "A series. Not just my investigation, but a collaborative project. We interview these families together, help them understand their histories in the context of the larger corruption network." Lucy's voice gained strength as she outlined her vision. "You provide the historical perspective, the understanding of how the system worked. I provide the investigative framework, the contemporary context." Billy considered this proposal, recognizing both its moral necessity and its personal cost. Working directly with families whose pain mirrored their own would mean reliving his shame repeatedly, examining it from new angles with each revelation. It won't be healing, he said finally. For any of us. No, Lucy agreed. But it might be helpful, to them, and to understanding how we prevent this from happening to the next generation. Billy looked at his granddaughter, really looked at her, and saw someone who had inherited Margaret's moral clarity, but tempered it with hard-won wisdom about the complexities of human failure. She wasn't the naive idealist who had first called him about Pete Collins's recording. She was something rarer, a person who had stared directly into the abyss of family complicity and chosen to use that knowledge in service of something larger than her own comfort. "There's a woman in Manchester," Billy said quietly, reaching for one of the letters. "Janet Morrison. Her husband was Tommy Castellano's teammate at City." He looked up at Lucy. "She might be a good place to start." Lucy smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her in months. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Billy confirmed, understanding that they were choosing to walk into the fire together, not because it would heal them, but because someone had to tend the truth that Margaret had planted in both their hearts. Chapter 12. The morning rain drummed against the train windows as Billy and Lucy traveled north to Manchester, their reflection ghosting across the wet countryside that blurred past. Billy watched his granddaughter organize her notes with the same methodical precision Margaret had once brought to her charity work. Every document numbered, every question carefully crafted to extract truth without inflicting unnecessary pain. "Nervous?" Lucy asked, glancing up from her preparations. Billy considered the question honestly. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of Janet Morrison's story, but of what we'll see in her eyes when she looks at us. The recognition." Lucy nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They were about to sit across from someone whose pain mirrored their own, a woman who had discovered that the person she'd loved most had feet of clay. There would be no hiding behind professional distance or journalistic objectivity. This was about wounded people trying to make sense of inherited shame. A taxi from Manchester Piccadilly took them through streets that Billy remembered from decades of sports commentary, stadiums and pubs where football dreams had been bought and sold like any other commodity. Now those same landmarks felt different, shadowed by the knowledge of how deeply corruption had infected the beautiful game. Janet Morrison lived in a terraced house near Old Trafford, its gardens still showing Margaret's influence in the carefully tended roses that somehow thrived despite the industrial air. She answered the door before they knocked, as if she'd been watching for their arrival through net curtains that spoke of old-fashioned respectability. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, studying Billy's face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile a voice she'd known for decades with the man standing before her. "I feel like I know you, but not like this. None of us know each other like this," Billy replied gently. "That's why we're here." Janet Morrison was 73, with silver hair pulled back severely and hands that showed the wear of decades spent cleaning other people's houses after her husband's football career ended in disgrace. Her sitting room was a shrine to a marriage that had been built on lies, photographs of David Morrison in his Manchester City kit, match programs from games where his performance had been purchased in advance. "I found the letters after he died," Janet said without preamble, settling into a chair that had clearly been David's by the wear patterns in the upholstery. Hidden in the shed, wrapped in plastic, 23 matches where he'd been paid to underperform. 23 times my husband betrayed everything he claimed to believe in. Lucy leaned forward slightly, her recorder running but unobtrusive. "How long were you married?" 51 years, Janet said, the number carrying the weight of a lifetime spent loving someone she'd never really known. 51 years of him coming home after matches, complaining about bad luck or poor tactics or unfair referees. All those years he looked me in the eye and lied about why they lost. Billy felt the familiar churning in his stomach, recognition of his own decades of self-deception reflected in someone else's story. "Did you suspect anything at the time?" Janet's laugh was bitter. "You don't suspect the person you love of being fundamentally dishonest about who they are. You make excuses. You blame circumstances. You protect them even from your own doubts." She looked directly at Billy. "But you understand that, don't you? Living with someone whose public face was built on lies? The question hit Billy like a physical blow. I was the public face built on lies, he said quietly. My wife lived with me. And how did she manage it? Janet asked, genuine curiosity cutting through her pain. Billy thought of Margaret's roses, her charity work, her insistence on small daily kindnesses that seemed to counterbalance the moral compromises he'd made. She planted things, he said finally, literally and figuratively. She focused on what she could grow, rather than what was already corrupted. Janet nodded slowly. David planted things too, near the end. After he retired, he spent years working with youth clubs, teaching kids about sportsmanship and integrity. Her voice cracked slightly. I think he was trying to balance the scales. Lucy looked up from her notes. Did it help? His work with the children? It helped him sleep at night, Janet replied. But it didn't change what he'd done, and it didn't prepare me for the moment I'd have to decide whether to protect his memory or face the truth about our life together. The three of them sat in contemplative silence, united by their shared understanding of that particular crossroads, the moment when comfortable lies became unbearable, and the only choice was between protecting the dead or serving the living. Why did you contact us? Billy asked eventually. Janet Morrison straightened in her chair, suddenly looking less like a grieving widow and more like the woman who had chosen to reach out to strangers because truth mattered more than comfort. Because your granddaughter proved it was possible to love someone and still hold them accountable, she said, looking directly at Lucy. Because maybe the only way to honor the good parts of who they were is to stop protecting them from the consequences of who they really were. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Billy found himself studying Janet Morrison's face, seeing in her weathered features the same transformation he recognized in Lucy, the evolution from protector of family myths to guardian of uncomfortable truths. That's a lonely place to stand, Lucy said softly, holding both the love and the accountability. Janet's smile was sad but genuine. Less lonely than I expected, actually. Turns out there are more of us than you'd think, people who've discovered that the choice between loyalty and honesty is a false one. Real loyalty sometimes requires destroying the comfortable stories we tell about the people we love. Billy shifted in his chair, feeling the familiar ache of recognition. David's teammates. Do any of them know you found the letters? 3 of them are dead, Janet replied matter-of-factly. But Tommy Castellano's still alive. Lives in Spain now. Owns a bar in Marbella that caters to English expats who want to relive their glory days. Her voice carried a note of bitter irony. I wrote to him 6 months ago, after I decided to contact you. Haven't heard back. Lucy made a note, but Billy could see her mind working beyond mere documentation. Would you want to confront him? If we could arrange it? Janet considered this, her fingers worrying the edge of a cushion that had probably been David's favorite place to sit after difficult matches. I used to think I wanted answers, explanations about how it started, who else was involved, whether David was coerced or if he volunteered. She paused, looking around the room filled with 40 years of marriage built on partial truths. But now I think what I really want is for someone else to understand what it feels like to discover that your entire adult life was lived in the shadow of lies you were never allowed to know existed. Billy felt something shift in his chest, not the familiar guilt that had plagued him for months, but something closer to purpose. That's why we're here, he said, to understand and to help others understand. The children are the hardest part, Janet continued, her voice growing stronger. David Jr. and Sarah both have kids who wear their grandfather's name on their school football kits. How do I tell them their hero was something more complicated than they're old enough to understand? Lucy looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. Maybe you don't tell them everything at once. Maybe you start with the truth that he was human, and humans sometimes make choices they spend the rest of their lives trying to make up for. Is that what you've told yourself about your great-grandfather? Janet asked, the question carrying no judgment, only curiosity about how others navigated the same impossible terrain. I've told myself that he was part of something larger and uglier than any individual choice, Lucy replied carefully. and that the only way to honor whatever good he did is to make sure that system can't survive in secret anymore. Janet nodded slowly, understanding the distinction between excusing behavior and contextualizing it. The letters mention names I recognize from the sports pages: players, officials, club executives who are still alive, still respected. She gestured toward a manila envelope on the side table. Some of them have children and grandchildren who think they come from families with integrity. Billy felt the familiar weight of moral responsibility settling across his shoulders. Each name Janet mentioned represented another family that would face the same devastating choice between comfortable ignorance and painful truth. Each revelation would create new casualties in the war between public mythology and private reality. "How many families do you think we're talking about?" he asked. "In total?" "Dozens, certainly," Janet replied. "Maybe hundreds, if the corruption was as systematic as the letters suggest." She looked directly at Billy. "Your father's BBC connections weren't unique. The network included people in television, newspapers, radio, anyone who could influence public perception of matches that had already been decided in private." Lucy's pen had stopped moving. A conspiracy that large requires institutional protection. People in positions of authority who made sure investigations were superficial, that uncomfortable questions weren't asked too persistently. "People like my father," Billy said quietly, the admission still painful after months of repetition. People who convinced themselves they were protecting the institution of football rather than corrupting it. Janet Morrison leaned forward, her eyes bright with the intensity of someone who had spent sleepless nights thinking through implications. "But here's what I keep coming back to. They're all old men now, dying or dead, their reputations established, their legacies secure. The only people who can be hurt by the truth anymore are their families. And the only people who can be helped by it," Lucy added, "are the families who are still living with inherited guilt they don't understand." The three of them sat in contemplative silence, each weighing the mathematics of revelation. How many lives improved against how many lives disrupted? How much institutional healing against how much personal devastation? "There's something else," Janet said finally, reaching for the manila envelope with hands that had clearly made a difficult decision. "Something I think you need to see before we go any further." Billy's pulse quickened as Janet Morrison's fingers worked at the envelope's clasp. The sound of paper rustling seemed unnaturally loud in the small sitting room, where decades of carefully maintained silence about David Morrison's secrets had finally been broken. "These came with the letters," Janet said, extracting what appeared to be photographs. "David kept them separate, wrapped in different plastic. I almost threw them away without looking. They seemed like old team photos at first glance." She handed the first photograph to Billy, who accepted it with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence. The black and white image showed 5 men in suits standing outside what looked like a London hotel, their faces partially obscured by the shadows of the building's overhang. Billy recognized the architectural style immediately. This was somewhere in Bloomsbury, probably from the mid-1980s. "The man second from the left," Janet said quietly. "That's David." Billy studied the figure, seeing in the younger David Morrison the same careful posture that characterized men who were perpetually looking over their shoulders. But it was the man standing next to him that made Billy's breath catch in his throat. "Christ," he whispered, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands. Lucy leaned closer, following Billy's stare to the tall, distinguished figure, whose face was partially turned toward the camera. Even in the grainy black and white image, the resemblance was unmistakable. "That's your father," Lucy said, her voice barely audible. "That's actually him." Billy nodded, unable to speak. For months, his father's involvement had been an abstract concept, words on recordings, names in documents, theoretical corruption that existed in the realm of possibility rather than concrete reality. But this photograph transformed theory into visceral truth. Here was his father, standing casually beside known match fixers as if they were old colleagues meeting for lunch. "There are more," Janet said, her voice gentle but insistent. She handed Lucy a second photograph, this one taken inside what appeared to be a restaurant. The image was clearer, the lighting better, and Billy's father was laughing at something someone had just said. He looked relaxed, comfortable, completely at ease in the company of men who were systematically corrupting the sport he was supposed to protect. When were these taken? Lucy asked, her journalistic instincts overriding the emotional shock. According to David's notes, this was March 1986, 3 months before the World Cup. Janet paused, letting the timing settle in their minds. There's a third photograph. This one showed the same group of men, but now they were joined by others. Younger men in tracksuits who were clearly players. Billy recognized 2 faces immediately from newspaper archives he'd studied obsessively since Pete Collins's recording surfaced. Argentine players, he said aloud, though the words felt strange in his mouth. These are members of Argentina's World Cup squad. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old mantelpiece clock that seemed to be marking the seconds, until everything they thought they knew about the 1986 World Cup was permanently altered. Billy stared at the photograph, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. "You understand what this means," Lucy said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just watched the final piece of a devastating puzzle click into place. Billy nodded slowly. It means the fix wasn't just about England losing. It was about Argentina being complicit in their own scripted victory. He looked up at Janet, seeing in her eyes the same terrible clarity that was washing over him. Maradona knew. They all knew. The hand of God, Janet said quietly. The goal that defined a generation, that became a symbol of divine intervention in sport. It was planned, choreographed. Just another scene in a performance that millions of people believed was real. Lucy was making rapid notes, her pen moving with the urgency of someone trying to capture revelations before they slipped away. But Billy found himself unable to focus on the practical implications of what they were discovering. Instead, he was remembering the sound of his own voice calling that infamous goal, the professional excitement he'd felt at witnessing what he thought was football history being made in real time. 38 years, he murmured. 38 years I've carried the pride of calling the greatest goal in football history, and it was all theater. Janet Morrison reached across the space between them and placed her hand on Billy's arm, a gesture of shared understanding from someone who knew exactly what it felt like to discover that your most treasured memories were built on carefully constructed lies. The question now, she said gently, is what we do with the truth. Because once we leave this room, once these photographs become part of your investigation, there's no taking it back. The whole mythology of that World Cup, everything people believe about Maradona's genius and England's noble defeat, all of it dies. Billy looked at his granddaughter, seeing in her face the same terrible resolve that had driven their journey this far. Lucy closed her notebook slowly, the gesture carrying finality rather than completion. Billy watched his granddaughter's face as she processed what they had discovered, seeing in her expression the same mixture of professional excitement and personal devastation that had been his constant companion for months. "We need to verify the photographs," she said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay before them. "Date stamps, location confirmation, facial recognition if possible. This level of accusation requires absolute certainty." Janet Morrison gathered the photographs with practiced efficiency, as if she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. David kept a diary during those months, nothing detailed, but enough to corroborate the timeline. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, even some boarding passes. She paused, looking directly at Billy. He saved everything, as if he knew someday someone would need proof of what really happened. Billy felt a strange kinship with David Morrison, another man who had carried secrets too large for one person to bear alone. "Guilt makes us sentimental about evidence," he said quietly. "We keep proof of our crimes because living with them becomes impossible without the option of eventual confession." "Is that what this is?" Lucy asked, gesturing toward the photograph spread between them like tarot cards predicting an unwelcome future. "A confession that took 40 years to find its audience?" Janet's smile was sad but certain. "David tried to tell me near the end, when the cancer made him reckless about consequences. He'd start sentences about things he needed to explain, then stop himself." She touched the edge of one photograph with her fingertip. "I think he wanted absolution. but he couldn't bring himself to destroy my illusions about our life together. Billy understood the paralysis of loving protection, the way affection could become another form of cowardice. He had spent decades curating Margaret's understanding of his work, editing out the moral compromises and ethical flexibility that characterized professional survival in a corrupt system. Even now, months after her death, he found himself grateful that she had died believing in his integrity. "There's something else we need to consider," Lucy said, her tone shifting into the clinical analysis that characterized her best journalism. "If these photographs prove what we think they prove, then every major sports corruption investigation of the past 40 years was either incompetent or deliberately ineffective." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for decades. Billy felt the familiar churning in his stomach as he considered the institutional failures that would be exposed alongside the individual crimes. How many investigators had been paid to look the other way? How many journalists had been convinced to focus on minor scandals while ignoring systematic corruption? "My thesis advisor is going to have a heart attack," Lucy continued, though her voice carried anticipation rather than concern. "This isn't just about sports anymore. This is about the reliability of every institution we've trusted to investigate itself." Janet Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at a garden that David had maintained with the same meticulous attention he had given to hiding his secrets. "The neighborhood has changed since we moved here," she said, though Billy sensed she was talking about more than architecture. Younger families, people who grew up after football, became a business instead of a sport. "Sometimes I envy them. They never believed it was pure in the first place." Billy joined her at the window, seeing in the suburban street a representation of innocence that could never be recovered. "Do you think they're happier?" he asked. "The people who never had illusions to lose?" "I think they're honest," Janet replied. "And there's something to be said for starting from a foundation of truth, even if it's ugly truth." Lucy gathered her recording equipment with movements that suggested their conversation was approaching natural completion. But Billy found himself reluctant to leave this room where secrets had finally been shared, where the terrible mathematics of revelation had been discussed by people who understood the costs involved. "What happens to us now?" he asked, the question emerging from some deeper uncertainty than mere logistics. "After we've seen what can't be unseen." Janet Morrison turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. "I suppose we become guardians of a different kind of truth, not the comfortable mythology that makes people feel good about the past, but the complicated reality that might help them make better choices about the future." Billy felt something shift in his understanding of his role in the unfolding scandal. For months, he had seen himself as either victim or perpetrator, caught between protecting his family's reputation and exposing institutional corruption. But Janet's words suggested a third possibility, that he could become a custodian of hard-won wisdom about the price of silence. "My granddaughter is braver than I am," he said, watching Lucy organize evidence that would reshape decades of sports history. "She's willing to sacrifice beautiful lies for ugly truth." "Maybe that's what each generation owes the next one," Janet replied gently. "The courage to face what the previous generation couldn't bear to examine." As they prepared to leave, Billy realized that the investigation had become something larger than personal redemption or professional vindication. They were documenting the anatomy of institutional deception, creating a record that future generations could use to recognize corruption before it became mythology. The truth about 1986 would destroy everything they had believed about sporting glory. But perhaps destruction was necessary preparation for building something more honest in its place. The drive back to London passed in contemplative silence, each of them processing the weight of what they now carried. Billy watched the countryside blur past the passenger window, thinking about how landscape looked different when you were returning from revelations rather than traveling toward them. The same fields and villages that had seemed innocuous on the journey out now felt like witnesses to conversations that would reshape everything they thought they understood about their own lives. Lucy navigated the traffic with the focused concentration of someone whose mind was simultaneously organizing evidence and calculating consequences. Billy could see her journalistic instincts working through the practical implications of what they'd discovered: verification requirements, legal considerations, the delicate choreography of releasing information that would destroy reputations while serving the larger cause of truth. "We need to talk about timing," she said finally, her voice cutting through the engine noise and Billy's internal reverie. "Once these photographs are authenticated, we'll have maybe 48 hours before someone tries to stop us from publishing." Billy felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that had become his constant companion since Pete Collins's recording first surfaced. Who would try to stop us? Anyone whose current position depends on the 1986 mythology remaining intact, Lucy replied matter-of-factly. FIFA officials, Premier League executives, broadcasters who built careers on calling matches they now know were fixed. There's an entire industry built on the sanctity of that World Cup. The scope of potential resistance made Billy's head swim. He had spent months thinking about personal consequences, his own reputation, his family's legacy, the impact on people like Janet Morrison who were still processing inherited guilt. But Lucy was right to focus on institutional pushback, the systematic effort that would mobilize once powerful people realized their carefully constructed narratives were under threat. "The photographs change everything," Billy said, thinking aloud. "Before this, we had audio recordings and circumstantial evidence. Serious allegations, but the kind that could be dismissed as conspiracy theories or personal vendettas." He paused, watching Lucy adjust her grip on the steering wheel. "But photographs of your great-grandfather with Argentine players 3 months before the tournament, that's documentation of premeditation." Lucy nodded, her expression grim. "It proves the fix involved both teams from the beginning. Not just England throwing the match, but Argentina participating in an elaborate deception that fooled the entire world." She glanced at Billy briefly before returning her attention to the road. Maradona didn't just cheat in the moment. He was part of a conspiracy that had been months in the planning. The implications settled over Billy like a weight pressing down on his chest. For 38 years he had carried professional pride about calling the hand of God goal, the moment when Diego Maradona seemed to channel divine intervention into sporting immortality. Now he understood that his voice had provided the soundtrack to performance art, a carefully orchestrated scene in a drama that millions of people believed was real. "I keep thinking about that moment," he said quietly. "Standing in the commentary box, watching Maradona punch the ball into the net, feeling like I was witnessing something miraculous." Billy's voice carried the hollow ache of someone discovering that their most treasured memory was built on deception. The crowd's reaction, the stunned silence from the England bench, all of it was genuine emotion responding to scripted theater. Lucy's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's what makes it so devastating. The audience's reaction was real, even though the performance was fake. Millions of people felt authentic joy or heartbreak while watching something that had been predetermined in hotel rooms and restaurant meetings. They passed a road sign indicating 30 miles to London, and Billy felt his pulse quicken with the approaching return to reality. In Janet Morrison's sitting room, surrounded by photographs and letters from the dead, the truth had felt manageable somehow, contained within the boundaries of shared understanding among people who had already accepted the necessity of revelation. But returning to London meant re-entering a world where most people still believed in the mythology they were about to destroy. "How do we do this ethically?" Billy asked, the question emerging from months of internal struggle. "How do we expose institutional corruption without destroying innocent people who just happen to inherit tainted legacies?" Lucy was quiet for several miles, clearly weighing the moral mathematics they faced. "I think we focus on systems rather than individuals," she said finally. "We document how corruption became institutionalized, how good people got swept into something larger than any individual choice." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "We tell the truth about what happened, but we tell it in a way that helps people understand how to prevent it from happening again." Billy found comfort in his granddaughter's measured approach, her instinct to use revelation as a tool for future prevention rather than past punishment. But he also understood that noble intentions wouldn't protect them from the consequences of what they were about to unleash. As London's outskirts came into view, Billy realized they were crossing from one world into another, leaving behind the realm of private truth and entering the domain of public accountability, where their discoveries would become weapons in battles they couldn't control. The familiar skyline of London emerged through the windscreen like a judgment rendered in steel and glass. Billy felt his throat tighten as they navigated the approach roads that would deliver them back to their ordinary lives. Lives that would never again be ordinary. The weight of the photographs in Lucy's messenger bag seemed to pull at the car's center of gravity, making every turn feel precarious. "We should go to my flat first," Lucy said, her voice carrying the practical authority that had guided them through months of revelations. "I need to scan everything before we take another step. Multiple copies, secure storage, backup documentation for the backup documentation." Billy nodded, though part of him wanted to suggest they keep driving, past London, past the responsibilities that waited for them, into some imaginary distance where the truth they carried could remain a private burden rather than a public reckoning. But he understood that escape had stopped being an option the moment they'd seen those photographs in Janet Morrison's sitting room. The traffic thickened as they entered the city proper, thousands of people returning to their evening routines with no awareness that everything they believed about sporting history was about to change. Billy watched pedestrians crossing at traffic lights, commuters emerging from underground stations, couples walking to restaurants where they would discuss their days over wine and familiar conversation. All of them still living in a world where the 1986 World Cup represented the last time football felt pure, before money and corruption transformed the beautiful game into something calculating and false. "I keep thinking about the ripple effects," Billy said as they waited at a red light near King's Cross. "Every journalist who covered that tournament, every historian who wrote about Maradona's genius, every child who grew up dreaming of scoring goals like the hand of God, all of them were building their understanding of football on a foundation of lies." Lucy's reflection in the side mirror showed the exhaustion that came from carrying revelations, too large for any individual conscience. "That's what institutions depend on," she replied. "The assumption that people in positions of authority are telling the truth. When that assumption breaks down, it doesn't just affect the specific scandal, it makes people question everything." The observation hung between them as they navigated the final miles to Lucy's neighborhood. Billy found himself thinking about trust as a form of social infrastructure, something that took generations to build and could be destroyed in the time it took to authenticate a set of damning photographs. How many other cherished memories would crumble once people understood how thoroughly they had been deceived? "Your thesis advisor," Billy said suddenly. "When you present this evidence tomorrow, what do you think he'll say?" Lucy's laugh carried no humor. "Professor Wilmington has spent 20 years writing about sports integrity. His entire academic reputation is built on analyzing the institutional safeguards that prevent exactly the kind of corruption we're about to expose." She turned into her street, the familiar row of Victorian terraces offering no comfort against the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. "I think he'll either have the intellectual honesty to help us get this right, or he'll find reasons why our evidence isn't sufficiently conclusive." Billy felt a chill at his granddaughter's pragmatic assessment of how even well-meaning people could become obstacles to truth when that truth threatened their professional investment in existing narratives. How many conversations like tomorrow's meeting had resulted in evidence being quietly filed away, investigations redirected towards safer targets, inconvenient discoveries transformed into academic footnotes? As Lucy parked outside her building, Billy noticed how the ordinary street scene, children playing football on the narrow pavement, neighbors chatting over garden fences, the warm glow of lights beginning to appear in windows, seemed almost surreal against the weight of what they carried. In a few days, or perhaps weeks, these same neighbors would read headlines that would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about sporting fairness. "Are you ready for this?" Lucy asked as she gathered her bag, the question carrying more weight than simple logistics. Billy considered the question seriously, running through an internal inventory of what readiness might mean. Was he prepared to watch his own legacy as a sports commentator become inseparable from one of the greatest deceptions in football history? Could he face the inevitable media attention, the interviews where journalists would dissect his voice calling goals he now knew had been predetermined? Did he have the courage to stand behind revelations that would destroy innocent people's faith in something they loved? "I don't think anyone can be ready for this kind of truth," he said finally. "But I think we're past the point where readiness matters. We know what we know, and that knowledge carries its own obligations. They sat in the car for another moment, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of London evening life, both understanding that once they entered Lucy's flat and began the process of authentication and verification, they would be committing themselves to a path that led inevitably toward the destruction of everything they had once believed about sporting glory. The truth was waiting for them, patient and terrible and unavoidable. Lucy's flat felt smaller with the weight of revelation filling every corner. Billy watched his granddaughter methodically unpack her messenger bag onto the kitchen table, each photograph emerging like evidence in a trial that would judge decades of carefully constructed mythology. The domestic setting, unwashed breakfast dishes still in the sink, a half-finished crossword puzzle abandoned beside the morning coffee cup, seemed absurdly normal against the magnitude of what they were about to document. "The scanner's in my bedroom office," Lucy said, her voice carrying the focused calm that Billy had learned to recognize as his granddaughter's response to overwhelming pressure. "But first, we need to catalog everything properly. Chain of custody, timestamps, witness statements about how we acquired each piece." Billy picked up one of the photographs, his father shaking hands with a man he now recognized as an Argentine Football Association official outside what appeared to be a Buenos Aires hotel. The image was crisp despite its age, the kind of professional photography that suggested this wasn't a chance encounter captured by accident. Someone had wanted these meetings documented, though Billy doubted they'd intended the evidence to surface 38 years later in his granddaughter's kitchen. "This level of documentation feels almost deliberate," he said, studying the careful composition of the shot. Like they wanted proof of what they'd accomplished, even if they planned to keep it secret. Lucy looked up from organizing the letters they'd discovered in Janet Morrison's sitting room. Or they needed evidence for insurance purposes. Think about it. If you're orchestrating something this massive, involving this much money, you want leverage over everyone involved. She held up a letter bearing David Morrison's handwriting, the careful script outlining payment schedules and contingency plans. These weren't just conspirators. They were businessmen covering their investments. The observation sent a chill through Billy's understanding of his father's role in the conspiracy. He had spent months trying to reconcile the loving parent he remembered with the institutional corruption Pete Collins had described on the leaked recording. But Lucy's analysis suggested something more calculating than opportunistic weakness, a systematic approach to deception that required careful planning and ruthless execution. "I need to call Professor Wilmington," Lucy said, reaching for her phone with hands that trembled slightly. "If we're going to do this properly, we need academic oversight from the beginning. Someone with institutional credibility who can vouch for our methodology." Billy watched his granddaughter dial the number, admiring her instinct to seek authoritative validation, even as he worried about expanding their circle of knowledge. Each person who learned their secret became either an ally or a potential obstacle, and they had no way of predicting which category any individual might choose when faced with evidence that challenged everything they'd built their careers upon. "Professor Wilmington? It's Lucy Hartwell. I need to see you tonight, if possible." She paused, listening to the response. "No, sir, this can't wait until my scheduled appointment. I've discovered something that will fundamentally change my thesis and possibly your understanding of sports integrity in the 1980s. Another pause. "Yes, sir. I understand how that sounds, but I have photographic evidence that proves the 1986 World Cup quarter-final between England and Argentina was fixed by a conspiracy involving both teams and English bookmakers." Billy could hear the sharp intake of breath through the phone line, followed by a long silence that suggested Professor Wilmington was calculating the implications of Lucy's claim. When he finally responded, his voice carried the careful neutrality of an academic who had learned to be skeptical of extraordinary assertions. "I'll be in my office in an hour," came the response through the speaker. "Bring everything you have and prepare to defend every aspect of your evidence acquisition. If you're wrong about this, Lucy, it could end your academic career before it starts. And if I'm right?" Lucy asked quietly. "If you're right," Professor Wilmington replied after another pause, "it could end a great deal more than careers." As Lucy hung up the phone, Billy felt the familiar acceleration of events that had characterized their investigation since Pete Collins's recording first surfaced. Each revelation led inevitably to the next confrontation, each piece of evidence demanding action that brought them closer to a public reckoning they couldn't control or contain. "He'll want independent verification," Lucy said, already organizing the photographs into a presentation sequence. Forensic analysis of the paper and ink, expert authentication of the handwriting, corroboration of dates and locations. She looked up at Billy, her expression mixing determination with exhaustion. "This isn't just journalism anymore, Granddad. This is historical revisionism on a scale that requires institutional resources." Billy nodded, understanding that they were about to transition from private investigators to public witnesses, from family members protecting inherited secrets to citizens exposing systemic corruption. The truth they carried was no longer theirs to manage privately. In an hour, they would sit across from an academic whose entire career had been built on analyzing institutional integrity, and show him proof that those institutions had been compromised at their foundation. After that, the truth would belong to history,